I found myself thinking back to this picture that was posted about a year ago. This is James Lindsay. For anybody who's not familiar with him, that is a prominent conservative writer and speaker, somebody who goes around to state legislatures and testifies in support of bills about how they have to ban critical race theory from the public schools because it's a front for the spread of Marxist thought. And he took this picture of himself at Highgate Cemetery. That's Karl Marx's grave, supposedly peeing on it. Although I have to say, if you zoom in here, I'm not convinced. I think he's just posing in the right position. And if you think about the sort of core of somebody like Lindsay, who if you aren't familiar with him, and think, okay, well, why even talk about this guy at all? Is he just kind of a clown? And not entirely no, but on the other hand, is somebody who is a best-selling author, is somebody who has an actual impact on the political process. And the sort of critique of Marx and Marxism that you get from somebody like James Lindsay is that, there'll be references to the horrors of Stalinist regimes in the 20th century. There'll be some extremely strange readings of what Marx himself says, and then there are going to be claims that everything that he doesn't like is essentially a form of Marxism. That, for example, his bugbear critical race theory is essentially Marxism. If you just do a Control F for class and substituted race, and it's more or less the same thing. It's still talking about oppression and conflicts between groups. And then that got me thinking about my own discussion that I had a couple of years ago with a prominent conservative, Charlie Kirk. This thumbnail is not, is like the slightly nicer one. There was the one that he put on his channel for his debate with me, said Charlie Kirk debates Marxist atheist professor, which is, I guess the sort of concatenation of bad things to be in the Charlie Kirk worldview. And I thought back to this moment in that debate where he asked me what I thought about Marx, and I said, well, I think Marx's theory of history is basically right. And his eyes lit up and he said, oh, well, that's like Hegel's, right? Because Hegel is, for some reason, somebody who these guys have internalized as sort of one of the great important diabolical bad guys. I'm not quite sure how this happened. You'd think it would be the other way around, that, from a right-wing anti-communist perspective, Marx would be the really bad one. And the bad thing about Hegel would be leading to Marx, but somehow it's become the other way around. And I said, well, no, it's the opposite of Hegel's view of history. Hegel's an idealist, Marx is a materialist. And he said, oh, but Marx was the president of the Young Hegelians, which is a sort of odd claim to make. The Young Hegelians refers to sort of a philosophical current in mid-19th century Germany. I don't think they had membership cards or elected a president. But I think this is typical of a lot of conservative critique of Marxism. And, I haven't even been talking about the worst examples. This is probably bad form because, you go to see somebody's talk, you assume that they'll be talking about books perhaps that they've read and you haven't. And this is a confession about a book that I haven't read because I couldn't. But Mark Levin is a talk radio host in the United States who's, he was never quite at the level of Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity, but he was a major talk radio host for many years, at many hundreds of AM radio stations around the country. You could hear him yelling into your ear every day for a couple hours. And he wrote this best-selling book called American Marxism. And I was going to co-write a review of it with my friend Matt McManus, and I picked up a copy and I started to read it, and I couldn't, and I made excuses and put it off. I gave Mark Levin some more of my money by picking it up on Audible, because I found that sometimes in the past, when I can't get through something, I could force feed myself bad prose by listening to the audiobook. But Mark Levin reads the audiobook, so the effect is that he's screaming the book into your ear for several hours straight, and I just couldn't do that either. And eventually, after many months of excuses and delays, I had to tell Matt that he could just write it by himself, which is why his name is the only one on that article you see here. Matt, is raised Catholic and, is officially no longer, but I think he's got some residual tendency towards guilt and self-flagellation that leads him to impose these things on himself. But you think, okay, am I just kind of cherry picking the worst examples here? I think that would be a fair concern. I would point out every single person I've mentioned so far, James Lindsay, Charlie Kirk, Mark Levin, these were all people who have massive audiences, who, many times more people have taken in their thoughts than probably everybody you went to see this weekend put together, because we live in a fallen world. But, you might think, all right, they're not the more serious examples. Then I think, okay, well, how about somebody who has been talking a lot over the years about Marxism and the evils of Marxism? It's been a major theme of his since he's been a public figure, and who did, credit where credit's due, do something that many of these guys will not, and engage in a public discussion with one of the leading sort of contemporary Marxists, which brings me to this guy. So Dr. Jordan Peterson having a public discussion in 2019 with a person who many of you have seen over the weekend, Slavoj Žižek. And probably what's most notorious from that discussion is that Peterson has, frequently, again, since he's become a public figure, frequently been talking about Marxism, or something he calls postmodern Marxism, or sometimes postmodern neo-Marxism. And there's a point in that discussion where Slavoj famously asks him, could you tell me who you have in mind? And he actually puts his face in his hands at one point, because he's trying so hard to think of some names. And he doesn't actually think of any names. To be fair, he did a couple of years later. This is something he tweeted about 2 or 3 years after that debate, where he actually produced on Twitter briefly his list. He says, postmodern neo-Marxists, Ibram X. Kendi, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Robin DiAngelo, Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks, Andrew Dworkin, Michel Foucault, Naomi Klein, Catherine McKenna, Judith Butler, Jacques Derrida, perhaps above all, Michel Foucault. As you can tell, he's above all because he's twice in the list. This list is not complete. Follow-up tweet, my favorite. He says Angela Davis, and my favorite part about that is that that's the only person on that 2-tweet list who'd actually call herself a Marxist. In fact, there are several names on there who aren't Marxists or postmodernists. They're not either one of those things. They're just people that Jordan Peterson doesn't like. Catherine McKinnon, for example, wrote extensively in criticism of both Marxism and postmodernism. So she doesn't even check either one of those boxes. But what I found maybe most interesting about that debate wasn't even really that moment. It was Peterson's discussion of the Communist Manifesto. So he said, anybody who watched that debate will remember this. He says at the beginning of his opening statement, well, he was going to read some of Slavoj's books leading up to it, but then, I don't know, he didn't have time or something. And so he said, I figured I'd go back to where all the trouble starts with Marx. So he reads the Communist Manifesto. He says, the beginning, remember, this is somebody who's been publicly criticizing something that he gives the name of Marxism to for many years, in mega best-selling books that, are on, can be found in, every large chain bookstore in the English-speaking world and have for years. Right now, I guarantee you, if you go to the Amazons, they'll do a list of the 20 most sold and read books from the last week. If it's not on this week, if you do it for a couple weeks in a row, you'll still see Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, which is mostly, inoffensive self-help pablum, but also does include a couple of rants about postmodern neo-Marxism. And Peterson acknowledges in his opening statement that he said, in preparation for this debate, he read the Communist Manifesto for the first time since he was 18. Now, I suppose it's just barely possible that even though he didn't get around to rereading the Communist Manifesto in the prior 40 years, that he was, paging through the Grundrisse and, Capital Volume 3. I have my doubts. And I particularly have my doubts when I look at something really specific that he says in the opening statement that he gives at that debate. So Peterson is honed in on the first sentence of the Communist Manifesto, which says all hitherto existing history is the history of class struggle, or at least that's the first sentence, the first chapter that prefaces the specters haunting Europe and all that. And he does forget about that sentence later in the statement, because he says, well, Marx doesn't seem to realize that hierarchy predates capitalism, but if all hitherto existing history is the history of class struggle, that would strongly suggest that hierarchy does predate capitalism. But at this point, he's remembered the sentence about how all hitherto existing history is the history of class struggle, and he says this. He says, Marx didn't seem to take into account that there are far more reasons that human beings struggle than their economic class struggle, even if you build a hierarchical idea into that which is a more comprehensive way of thinking about it. Human beings struggle with themselves, with the malevolence that's inside themselves, with the evil that they're capable of doing, with their spiritual and psychological warfare that goes on within them. And we're also actually always at odds with nature, and this never seems to show up in Marx, and it doesn't show up in Marx. So, I want you to remember that line. Right? We're always at odds. We're also actually always at odds with nature, and this never seems to show up in Marx. Right? Marx isn't interested in how humans are at odds with nature. Hold that thought. And while you hold it, I want to think about why we're talking about this for just a minute. Because, the title of the talk is Why Marx Deserves Better Critics. And I want to make this point in the most sort of ecumenical possible way, right? Regardless of your feelings about Marx and Marxism, why it would be better to have a higher caliber of criticism than you're getting either from the most prominent conservative writers and speakers and thinkers in the Western world right now, or from other sources that we'll probably discuss as the discussion goes on. And it seems to me that the anti-Marxist case for better critics of Marxism is pretty straightforward. Maybe you think this just there's just not enough of a live debate there. There's nothing that's there's nothing that hasn't been settled, and it's just not worth your time. Probably you don't, because you wouldn't be coming to this talk if you did think that. But if you do think that there's something there that's worth talking about, that's worth engaging with, that's worth criticizing, and certainly all of the negative examples have been held up so far, your James Lindsay's, your Jordan Petersons, your Mark Levin's, your Charlie Kirk's, clearly do think there's something there that's worth talking about because they talk about it all the time. Well, if you think that, then, this is not a deep point, but I think it's worth making. You haven't really done much if you've just knocked down a straw man that you've constructed in your own imagination, that you should be making the best case possible, that you should be making sure that you're really engaging meaningfully with what Marx says, and you're thinking hard about it, and you actually, kind of have come up with a case against it that is going to be serious and is going to matter because you want to show that it's wrong. Again, if you take it seriously enough to think it's worth criticizing at all, why wouldn't you want to do that? And then, of course, I think a little bit more subtly, the pro-Marxist case for better critics of Marxism is that if you are sympathetic to Marxism, either in whole or in part, right, either you think that the sort of fundamental claims of Marxist theory is true, or even if you just think that there's that there are valuable insights that could be gleaned from parts of it, even if you would reject significant other parts. Either way, you are going to have a much more serious and a much more worthwhile account of Marxism if you have to defend it against the best criticisms that are out there. If you have to, if you're looking at people who are actually subjected it to intellectually serious criticism, then you're going to end up with a much more defensible and interested Marxism. So with that in mind, I want to start thinking about some particular, or at least one particularly popular criticism of Marxism and how this can help us think about what would or wouldn't count as a serious critique. So something that you see all the time from all of these guys is, well, look, socialism doesn't work. Just look at the 20th century. People will start talking about the Soviet Union, of course. That's the Exhibit A. But very often, to try to make this a better argument, they'll say, well, look, every single time you guys have gotten what you wanted, it's always been a disaster. Look at the Soviet Union. Look at, People's Republic of China. Look at the Eastern European client states. Look at sometimes they'll throw in Pol Pot's Cambodia, which is my favorite because that's almost an accounting error transferring between columns in the Cold War because the Cambodia was actually being backed by the United States for Cold War reasons against the Soviet Union after Vietnam invaded Cambodia to try to stop the killing fields. This is not a conspiracy theory. You could look at the UN votes. But putting that gripe aside, right, this argument, I think, has some aura of plausibility, and there are better and worse ways to respond to it. Probably the least interesting way to respond to it is to say, no, that's not socialism at all, right? That like real socialism would be popular democratic control of the means of production, workers control, workers democracy, something like that. And that's not socialism, so none of that is even relevant to anything that I'm saying. I'm not entirely unsympathetic to that response, but I think that it bogs you down in a really uninteresting semantic debate. Say, well, that depends on what your definition of socialism is. And my position on that is that I don't care. I'm bored the second that the conversation starts. I think that if you define socialism in a way that makes that count, very good. That's not the kind of socialism I would want. If you define it in a way that doesn't count, that's fine too. But I think a more substantive response is to point out that if the opponent's claim is that every attempt at a better sort of socialism, more like the kind that non-Stalinist radical socialists would tell you that they want, that does involve popular democratic control of the state and popular democratic control of the means of production, if what they're really saying is, well, every time that has been attempted, it's led to totalitarianism, that's a better and more interested argument. But it's not a very good argument for two reasons. The one that's less important for where we're going is that if you're talking about an attempt to implement socialist democracy and you're ending up with authoritarian state socialism a la the Soviet Union, at most, you've got an inference with the sample size of one. Because there was no point at which, the Maoist revolution in China, there was an attempt at creating socialist democracy that just turned into this. There's no point at which, Enver Hoxha's takeover of Albania, was an attempt at implementing socialist democracy that just turned into this. Those were self-conscious attempts to replicate an already existing model of command economy plus one-party state as already existed in the Soviet Union. That's what the leaders of these parties thought of as socialism. That's what they thought of as their goal. So depending on how you read the history of the Russian Revolution, you have maybe one example of an attempt to create a socialist democracy that degenerates into totalitarianism. And that's maybe because there's a lot of historical debate to be had about how serious the Bolsheviks ever were about that, etc. You've got a sort of Trotskyist version of that history according to which that was their goal. You've got a sort of anarchisty version of history according to which that really wasn't, and that they're very authoritarian from the beginning. I'm not particularly interested in adjudicating that. I just think it's worth noting if we're going to be talking about this argument. But the deeper and more interesting response to that argument is that socialism and Marxism are not coextensive categories. Right? That all Marxists are socialists, but not all socialists are Marxism. Karl Marx did not invent the idea of socialism. He is not the first socialist. And so if you want to criticize Marxism in particular, you'd better be criticizing things that Marx himself actually thought. Now, one way of using the word Marxism would just be to mean everything that everybody calls themselves a Marxist thinks. The problem with that is that it's a really uninteresting category. Because think about all the people in the last, say, 100 years who've called themselves Marxists. Plenty of social democrats in the early 20th century, especially, who served in coalition governments with regular liberal capitalists, thought of themselves as Marxists. Stalin thought of himself as a Marxist. Terry Eagleton, right? So himself as a Marxist. Pol Pot thought of himself as a Marxist. Frederick Jameson thought of himself as a Marxist. The Baader-Meinhof gang thought of themselves as Marxists. You try to do the overlap region of the Venn diagram between all those circles, and you're not going to find much that's interested that's there. So I think a much more interesting way to use the word Marxism is to refer to what Marx particularly actually thought, particularly as regards the things that made Marx historically distinctive, the thing that made Marx different from earlier versions or later versions of socialist thought. And this takes us to probably the most significant problem with the "what about Russia" objection to Marxism, which is that if you want to criticize Marx, you should at least make sure that you're actually disagreeing with him. What does Marx think about the possibility of successful socialist experiments in any given society at any given point? This is really important, and this takes us back to the quote from Dr. Peterson, where he says that Marx doesn't seem to be aware of or to be thinking about humanity's struggle with nature. That doesn't seem to be on his radar. Well, it is on his radar. In fact, it's the centerpiece of Marx's theory of history. So historical materialism, the thing that Marx thought, is about the idea that what he calls the legal and political infrastructure of any given society, the system of laws, the way the political system works, is ultimately downstream of what Marx calls the relations of production. That's whether you have lords and peasants, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, whatever the arrangement is in your society, what the relationship is between what he called the immediate producers and whoever is in charge of production in your society. And those relations of production are downstream from the level of development of what he calls the forces of production. The forces of production are, roughly speaking, this is Marx's way of talking about the capacity of a society to produce stuff. And crucially, one of the very most important differences between Marx's version of socialist theory and earlier kinds of socialist thought is that Marx doesn't think of capitalism as an avoidable moral mistake. Right? Marx's conception of capitalism is not that this is this horrible wrong turn that, if only people at some earlier stage of history, if only some considerate time traveler had, given them some socialist pamphlets, they could have avoided all of this, right? If Adam and Eve had been given copies of the Communist Manifesto instead of apples, then all of this horrible stuff with class society could have been avoided. That's not at all what he thinks. Marx thinks that capitalism is a historically necessary stage of development, and that it is in fact by passing through capitalism that you create the conditions for the possibility of a successful socialism. So something that if you read this book, Unlearning Marx, by audience member in the back row, Steve Paxton, then something that he points out in there is that Marx actually wrote specifically about Russia. That not only is Marx's general theory one according to which you have the possibility of a successful socialist society, in other words, of a more democratic and egalitarian economic order, sort of taking root, of being able to create a more equally shared material abundance, is something that you only get if you're starting from a certain standpoint of material development. Not only is that something that just as a general claim pretty clearly entails that a semi-feudal empire in which capitalism barely existed in a few footholds in major cities, Petrograd and Moscow, would not have the material basis for having a successful form of socialism. Not only is that entailed by the general theory, but Marx specifically writes about Russia and says, yeah, there's no way that you could go straight to socialism in Russia unless it was hooked up with a revolution happening everywhere else, in Europe. And so maybe if you had this pre-existing industrial base that could help support it, then maybe, but otherwise definitely not. For reasons that the first major Russian Marxist, Gory Plekhanov, writes about. He says that if you have a non-industrialized country in which you attempt to go straight to socialism, you're going to end up not where you want to go, but with what he calls Incan industrialization. That, in other words, the process of forcing industrial development in those backward circumstances is going to lead you to have to actually regress to a more direct form of coercion, which was a good call. That's more or less what happened in Stalin's Russia in the 1930s. And this is something that even Lenin and Trotsky, in leading the Russian Revolution, believed themselves and wrote about extensively. They thought that they were rolling the dice on the possibility of a revolution that could start in Russia, extend to Europe, crucially Germany, and then the rest of the world, and that would take hold of the industrial machine that had already been built up by capitalism, and that's what would create the possibility of a more equally shared version of modernity. That anytime, the Marxist conception of what socialism is that you could have a version of high-tech modernity that was egalitarian and democratic, because fruits were shared in a different way than they could be under capitalism. Now, you can disagree with that for any number of respectable reasons. Right? You could think, for example, that that ecologically we actually need to degrow in order to stave off crisis, and so the kind of industrial development that Marx thinks that you need in order to have successful global socialism is not even desirable. Right? That's one view that plenty of people have. You could think that capitalism is fine and that we should just keep it up forever. Now, I'm not particularly sympathetic to either of those views. I don't think I'm shocking anybody who came here when I said that. But I do want to make the point here that if somebody has actually carefully read this stuff and they want to make one of those arguments, then we could have an interesting discussion. If you're, if all you want to do is to use, Marx as a kind of bogeyman to talk about whatever your favorite fixations are, in order to provide a little sort of emotional juice for your political project by conjuring up the horrors of the 20th century, then, I guess best of luck to you. That might work out for you. You're not going to be making an interested argument that's going to convince anybody who's done the reading. And my God, wouldn't it be better if we did that? And there, I think we'll probably have to leave off. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.